for supporting the sixth programme.
The sixth already? Wow.
Yes.
Goodness
I can't
me.
remember which one you came to.
I think the second,
Okay.
when I joined the trust. Yeah.
So
Okay.
I do appreciate you taking the time out.
Oh, I'd
of your
love to
busy
come be
diary.
here. Good.
And if you could just perhaps speak to the group around leadership and career success,
Okay.
followed by certificates, and maybe you can listen to a few of the presentations.
Okay, we'll do.
before you go.
We'll do before I've got to go off.
Okay.
So, thank you very much, Harpal. So, I'm James Reilly. I'm your Chief Executive, and I always love coming to this event, actually. So, it's an easy give in my diary, which is a busy diary, but because it's very inspiring. I won't be able to hear all your presentations, and some of you who are going to give them while I'm here will be feeling even more nervous, but you shouldn't. I'm not here to judge you or assess you, and I'm always impressed by what I hear. So relax if you're worried you're in that position. A little bit about me, I think, because I think leaders have to tell a bit about their personal story. So I've been 30 years now in the care business, if you want to call it that. And I started out, I was just greeting Mary Vick actually, because I had an earlier career I was embarked upon training as a Catholic priest, and that took me to the Philippines for 2 years at one particular time. But that was different, and although in that role I did some caring roles, I did a porter's job in the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, and I did a healthcare assistant's job in a hospice in Cheadle in Manchester, while I was part of that, my formation process during that period of time. So I wasn't, and I also did a job working in a homeless hostel for alcoholics in Manchester, right alongside the Manchester Royal Infirmary. I'll tell you a funny story about that, because given the client group, I guess I would say, that I was supporting, I lived in this hostel. We were live-in assistants, so you lived alongside the 30 or so men who were staying in that particular hostel. And given their condition and their addiction, they would regularly have accidents, and some of them quite serious. So I was a frequent attender with them in the A&E department of the hospital right opposite the hostel. And you know, you dressed very casually in that environment. I certainly wasn't dressed in my suit and tie when I was in that particular role. And I'll never forget the nurse who was attending one of the gentlemen I brought in there. Just confused us as two friends, you know, and therefore I also must have had an addiction problem. And the way I was then spoken to as somebody who she assumed had alcohol problems themselves, I don't know how I was appearing on that particular day, was very interesting to just walk in the shoes of somebody like that and see how you're treated. So that was an early experience. But really in care properly, I started as a healthcare assistant in a rehab unit in a residential care home in Harlesden. So we were talking about the Alexandra unit at Princess Louise, and I started in a very, very similar setup in Harlesden, where I was for a year, and I started as that unqualified healthcare assistant. But I was, through complete accident, promoted quite quickly. Both the deputy manager and the manager left. The deputy manager to go and train to be a social worker, and the manager, I think she had a slight alcohol problem, if I'm honest with you. She certainly used to walk in at 11 o'clock in the morning, and there was always a glass of wine on her desk. So I think you could qualify that as a problem, okay? And if you worked in residential care in those days, actually that was not an uncommon issue. Yeah, there are a few people who will remember folks like that, and it didn't somehow impede you from being a manager, which was interesting. But I was therefore asked to act up as a deputy, and then we had a series of acting managers, and finally, out of desperation, quite quickly, I was asked to act up as the manager as well of that unit. So that's very unusual, to have a set of circumstances in which you're on the floor one day, and I think within 6 months I was then managing the unit. But it is also a story about promotions, and advancements in careers are often as accidental as they are planned. And I'm not one of those managers who has planned my career. You know, some people think about it in 3-year blocks or 5-year blocks, and you may have been talking about doing some planning. But I have been more opportunistic in what I've done in that period of time. I won't take you through my whole career history, but very briefly, just to complete the story. I then moved on to undertaking a role, so this was all in Brent Council, it was an interesting project actually, because it was a joint health and social care project way back then, 30 years ago. And so we had physios, we had a physio, a nurse, and an occupational therapist who were from the health service on the same ward with us, not unlike I think Ellesmere, we put some therapists into the rehab unit in Ellesmere, in KNC. And on the back of that experience, I was recruited to a very novel startup project in Hackney, which was a community rehab team, which had a staff group of 30, and including 2 doctors from the geriatric department of the local hospital, physios, occupational therapists, nurses, social workers, the lot, to undertake assessments, multidisciplinary assessments for frail elderly people in the community. Again, it was funded on a sort of new initiatives money from the Department of Health and Social Care at that time, and it didn't last. The funny thing was, we're now trying to set these kind of teams up everywhere, and in the 2-year period that we had of the funding, it ended after that funding, that we couldn't get it onto mainstream funding. But I went on from that to manage the council's home care services, and that was at the time, again, most of you are too young to know this, but that was at the time when they were called home helps, and they only did bathing, washing and shopping. And then they became home care workers, and they started to do more issues. And if you were a community nurse, there used to be wild debates and arguments about who would wash and who would dress, and whether that was a home helps job or a healthcare assistant's job in the community. And I think some of those debates still go on today, actually, if you're in that neck of the woods and doing that. But that was a large service. There were about 700 staff there. An interesting experience that comes to my mind then was this was in the period of Margaret Thatcher's government and the beginnings of competitive tendering, where council services were beginning to be let out to private sector tenders. So now, if you receive a home help, you'd be very lucky to receive a home help directly employed by a council. There are a few such services left in the country, hardly any in London. And the vast majority of them are now delivered through private companies under contract or voluntary sector organisations under contract to councils. Well, that was all starting way back then in the middle 80s. And I had to go out. It was the days before mobile phones and laptops and all the rest of it. In fact, I think computers were just coming in. We were just getting email and computers at that time. We were on electronic typewriters. That's how ancient I am. And I had to go out and do a presentation to these home care workers on something like 30 different patches. 600 staff, around 30 different patches. And I had to take a little mini television with me and a video that I had to put in it. And so I was on the buses going around Hackney with my television and turning up at these little community halls and what have you to give this presentation, this pre-filmed sort of presentation, to advise them that this change was coming and that we would have to begin competing for services and that we needed to think about that. So that was an interesting experience of now something, even as healthcare professionals, we have to take for granted. We're regularly looking at what we have to tender for and how we have to continue to win the contracts that we have, so that our jobs as leaders in healthcare is, yes, of course, always focused on the quality of the care that we're giving to our patients. But equally, we know that quality only works if we're in the context of a dynamic and committed team, if we have good team leadership, if we sit within an organisation that delivers effective systems for us to operate within. All of these things impact upon whether somebody can deliver a good service. And as a leader, you're charged with whatever level of responsibility you have to trying to create those conditions that people can perform to their best and make it easy, I think, to do the right thing. Because most professionals are committed to wanting to do the right thing for their patients. But that experience was about turning around to people and saying it's no longer about a job for life. You join the council and that's it, and the council just has to put up with whatever you're prepared to provide to them. And I think we've been on a very similar journey in healthcare in more recent years, and it's not always been a comfortable journey. But I think the important message that we should remember is that 94% of healthcare services continue to be delivered directly by the NHS. And although there is this sort of fear and some legitimate concern about what it means to compete and whether the private sector with a profit motive can be as focused on patient care, I personally believe it can actually, and I do believe that sometimes it can be better if you're, in the way in which it's organised. And it comes down again to exactly the same things. How much people get that you can only get to deliver care if you're very focused on it and if you lead and organise well. But even in that environment, only 4% of direct health care is in the hands of the private sector, that commissioned by the NHS. There's clearly those who go privately, that's a different story. So that was an interesting experience of having to move the whole model of thinking and approach to one of direct provision, in which, frankly, the model was a job for life, to one in which people had to think about how they changed the services from home care to home help, how they had to change their operating model, take on different roles and responsibilities, and how they also had to prepare for a position in which they would compete. The story in that particular sector is I went on to manage other things in addition to home care in Hackney before I moved across to Hammersmith and Fulham Council, where I got a much wider portfolio of provider services, about 3,000 staff, as many as exist in our healthcare trust. And we had nurseries, old people's homes, daycare centres, home help centres, rehab units, you know, a panoply of services, and that was for adults and children. So I was managing that. We even had a very large and impressive prison for young offenders that we operated, Stamford House. It's now destroyed, actually, but it was a quite well-known establishment, sometimes notorious establishment, actually. So it was a big panoply of services. Over the 15 years I was within Hammersmith and Fulham, from being an assistant director managing that provider division to becoming the director of services, that staff group dwindled to 300 from 3,000. And so I oversaw a period of contracting out of nearly all of those services in one way, shape or form. And the predominant issue was the terms and conditions issue. That we had some great services, we had some very poor services, if the truth be known, as well. And we had some great staff, but we were locked into a system of national terms and conditions which made them completely uncompetitive. And then when you got a financial crunch, it was very difficult to resolve that particular position. It was, however, also quite part of policy during those days, and by then we were out of the Thatcher period and into the Blair period, where both sides of the equation, the political equation, had got into wanting commissioners and providers to be separate in the way that we are now. And you'll know that community services left primary care trusts become independent trusts, such as we're orientated in that time. So through that brief description of my career advancement, I landed up just also managing the council's housing stock alongside adult social care and some of its interactions with the police and property developers in the planning and regeneration functions of the council. And then came here to this role nearly 4 years ago. This February it'll be 4 years ago, and as the first permanent chief executive for the trust. The trust was established 4 years ago on November the 1st, 2010. So that was a big jump into a new world. I'd always worked in close partnership with my healthcare colleagues, but and you could see some commonality between particularly working in the community, delivering social care, particularly adult social care, but also children's services, alongside many healthcare professionals. And obviously we shared some of the same people, many of the same people in what we did. But working for an elected, politically led organisation at a local level is very different to working for the NHS, which, although it's politically accountable through the Secretary of State in Parliament, doesn't have local politicians sitting on boards and making decisions as we do in local councils. So there's a very different culture and way in which people look at how services are to be developed. That quick-potted history is a story about how you get to different places. In the middle of that story, what I've talked about is very big changes to services. And some of those markers that have happened, and the opportunities that those changes have brought for me personally, because new teams developed, new leadership roles developed in one way or another. The creation of Central London Community Healthcare Trust was an opportunity for me to compete for this particular position. The position did not exist before when it was in the PCT. And of course, our times are no different. In fact, the NHS, I've just come back from a national conference in Liverpool. It was held on Tuesday and Wednesday, which all the leaders of the national NHS were present and articulating what is happening across the NHS. And people who've worked for 30 years and more in the NHS are saying that in their career times, this is the period of the greatest change they've ever seen in the NHS. And many of you will know it's been through some considerable amount of change up until now. But they're calling this period a period of unprecedented change. And it's obviously driven by the changes in the health needs in our population, and predominantly by our ageing population. The great success story of the NHS is also its greatest challenge now, the way in which it's helped us all live healthier for much longer, and now well into our 80s and 90s. I think I was having 2 conversations about folk whose grandparents or parents are in their 90s, and my father's just coming up to his 88th birthday. So, you know, and is fit and well and of good mind, etc., and mobile. I mean, just remarkable how people are living well into a much older age. But it's presenting a whole different disease burden to us and requires us to deliver change in a very different way. The good news about that is that a lot more of that care needs to be delivered in people's homes or in their communities, and that's what we're about, and that's what we do, and that's what we're organised to do. So for us, it's a great opportunity. For district general hospitals, particularly for smaller district general hospitals, a particular challenge. Either they've got great pressure on beds, or the view is that we've got to do less, we've got to manage people better in the community, which will mean they go less times to hospital, which means the income going to hospitals needs to shrink. So either way, the DGHs are in a bit of a cleft stick, in a difficult challenge to manage their way through this transition that is happening. So as a leader, you have to be aware, obviously. You can't have your eyes blinkered and just on delivering today's task. You have to be aware about the environment that you're in and aware of the issues that environment turns up for you. So for this organisation, I have to go to these conferences to scan the horizon, to look and see what is likely to be there in 2, 3, 4, 5 years ahead. How do we have to position ourselves? What if that is an opportunity that we should grasp and we should be positioned well to take advantage of, to be a good and thriving and growing organisation? What might it mean for you and your colleagues in the way in which services have got to develop? For example, we're in the throes of preparing a submission next week for something called the Community Independence Service, a group of nurses and therapists who are going to work closely with social care and others. And they're currently operating in pilot form a virtual ward in Hammersmith and Fulham, which is dealing with people with quite acute needs who'd normally be in a hospital bed, in their own bed, being supported by GPs and this team. That team runs at the moment an 8 to 8 service, seven days, which is very different to the, some of the parts of the community nursing service that we've got at the moment. And it's expected to respond to needs within 2 hours, whereas most referrals in a community nursing team would take maybe 24, 48 hours before somebody could deal with that. So that's a whole new model of delivery, and that's what it's going to mean to be able to look after people closer to home more regularly and to manage them better so that they're not blue lighted out into A&E and onward into a bed admission. But that's an example of looking at the horizon and beginning to think how services need to reshape. In the middle of that is how do skills reshape for the staff that we lead. So they've got a number of what they call hybrid workers. It's a terrible phrase, okay? But it's a point, I drive a hybrid car that does a battery part of the time and petrol part of the time. It always reminds me of that. But this hybridity is around some of the tasks that social care does and some of the tasks that our healthcare assistants do, either rehab healthcare assistants or nursing healthcare assistants. And the tasks in that role have been combined into one role that people can deliver. So that's a fairly novel way of going about things. Interesting career advancements for those particular individuals to work in a different way with people. So you're scanning that horizon, you're thinking about the implications for how your service may change, and you're thinking about the implications for your staff and how their roles and responsibilities might change in the course of all that change. Clearly, at the same time, all the time, we're focusing on trying to do something better for patients, keep them well at home longer, and at the same time, deliver the benefits for the system. We all are sick to death, probably about being told about how severe the financial crisis in the country is and how that bears down on all parts of our lives. And, you know, we know that we haven't had those extra pennies in our pockets for several years through the lack of pay awards, et cetera, et cetera. But we also know that money is tight and going to continue to get tighter for delivering our services. So we've got to make every pound work harder and use all the resources we've got, whether it's you, the staff, whether it's these kind of environments, whether it's the kit that we use, is to make sure that all the possibilities that brings us is really being marshalled to work very, very effectively, so that there must be nothing that annoys a group of committed healthcare professionals such as yourselves than to see some waste or duplication. when money is really tight, when you're lacking another colleague alongside you and the workload is very heavy, you know. Because if we can make the money stretch further, we might be able to solve that particular problem. So it's a juggling act between continuing always to be very focused on the end purpose, patient benefit, on the fact that that patient benefit is very dependent upon people and teams and healthy people in teams, and I don't just mean physically healthy, I mean psychologically healthy teams, and then living and working in a healthy working environment in which to do that, but one which is constantly changing, one which is very dynamic, whether we're going to be working in the same building that we're working in, whether we're going to be working along the same colleagues, whether we're going to be using this piece of equipment or that piece. We're about to move a new patient record system over the next 12 months as we move from Rio, which is being phased out, into System 1, whether we can have more mobile platforms, more mobile tablets and phones which we can do our work off securely in ways. So all of these things present things that need thinking about, working through into the services that we deliver. And I think these are all aspects of good leadership. This sense of very tight patient focus, always interested in the ends and the means and the outcomes for the patient, but realizing that those are absolutely dependent upon our colleagues, the people we are, the teams that we exist in, and the best use of resources that we have. And doing that with an appetite to change, to not, I mean, all of us would not be human if we did not have days when we are completely fatigued and sort of, what's the right word, overwhelmed by some of the nature of change that can be impacting upon us at times. And I'm no different to that. I mean, I've got some very interesting things happening in my network of managers that I relate to, particularly in Northwest London. There's a lot of turnover going on there, change happening there. And that makes it quite difficult for me to plan changes in partnership with people, because I need to trust people and work in partnership with them. And if they're constantly changing, I can't build a community of need that we can work together on these things. So we can feel fatigued and overwhelmed by change from time to time, but we have to find the resilience. And I think some of the things you've been talking about with Harpal is how you build your resilience, both in yourself personally and with your colleagues, to be able to confront that and not lose that passion and that restlessness for improving things, for finding a way to think about this could be done better, we could do this differently. That would make a real difference to the patient, or that would make a real difference to the team. Let's make it happen. Let's make it happen. Let's not wait for somebody else to make it happen, or let's wait till somebody from on top, myself or somebody else, makes it happen for us. Because leadership is, at one level, about exercising power. It is about making things happen. It's not about words, as I'm speaking to you today. Words spoken are empty unless they're followed up by deeds or actions. And so the real leaders that inspire us and who we respect are people who make a difference on the ground. And if you just think about, God, the people I most want to be in a team with, or the person I most want to see lead me, why is that? Reflect on that. And it's mostly because they make really positive things happen for folk. And that would be my last word on leadership. And hold that in mind, and I don't think you can depart far from being effective and good leaders. And thank you for taking the time, the commitment along your side. You're very, very busy, even more busy, and still to be yet busier lives that it is all part of being in the NHS at the moment about. But to take time out to commit to developing yourselves to be more effective leaders and to take some charge of your own career development is a great thing to do. And it shows real commitment, it shows real pride. I think that sort of judicious selfishness is what I would call it. If you don't do it, somebody else is not going to do it for you. I mean, we're adults now, we're not children. And only good can come from it. Not necessarily in the straight lines that you think. I go back to my career has advanced in a zigzaggy sort of way. But by equipping yourselves with skills, by building your mentality and resilience, you will be in a good place to take advantage of the opportunities that arise when they do arise. So thank you very much. Well done. Or even slow questions. Don't be shy. Yes?
At the time when you were younger and you were doing healthcare system, do you ever think or have it in mind that you're going to be the director one day?
No, I didn't set out in my life to turn around and say, I want to be that director or chief executive. In fact, for many years as a director, I was asked to be a chief executive in council. So I was approached by the so-called headhunters. You know, it's a bit like you get to a certain level and senior appointments, they go and get people to search for people to come into particular jobs. So I used to get quite a lot of calls asking me to go for interviews for chief execs. And I was very reluctant. I was very ambivalent about going for that particular role because A, I'm very committed to care. I'm particularly committed to things we say on our mission statement about greater independence for adults and a great start for children. That's been my sort of theme through my life. When I started on those rehab units, I realized how much, if your independence is compromised through ill health or other social circumstances, what a blight that is on your life and how that differentiates you from me and the choices I can make and the things I can do versus you. And I've always wanted to make a difference in that area. So when I was asked to take on bigger roles that would take me more remote from that, I resisted those roles. And what was a great opportunity for me to become the chief executive of this organization was, guess what this organization's all about? It's about precisely making the conditions for you and others like you to be really successful in doing that. So it was an easy choice for me to do, to apply for this position when I was asked to consider it at that time. It was quite severe competition for that role because I competed with 5 other chief executives from within the NHS for the role, and I'd not been a chief executive before. So it was not an easy process, that interview is there. So no, I didn't have that desire, but earlier in the stage, I think one of the things that did propel me to go for positions for a team leader role or a service manager role or an assistant director role was partly I'd assumed a bit of a leadership role amongst my peers. You know, you could tell that peers sort of did look to you for some advice and guidance. I wasn't the only one. And they would sort of turn around and say, oh, I want you to think about going for that because we want the devil we know rather than some bastard who's going to come and do us all harm, you know. So there's a little bit of that cajoling. There's also a bit about, you begin to think, do you know, I could do that in terms of my team leader, and I'm a bit anxious about somebody else coming in and being my boss when I think I could do that as well as them, if not better. And you're probably also quite passionate about your service and the way in which your service is developing, and you'd like to see that through, and you're a bit worried that somebody else might come in and take it off in another direction. So those are the sorts of thoughts that have propelled me to do that. There's only twice where I've been asked to do something completely different by a more senior person. One was when I was asked to go in and manage the home care service, and I had a very difficult time because there were 4 service managers who headed that service, and that was their only next promotion. And it was very rare for them to get another promotion above that. That would have been the top of their career. And all 4 of them competed for that job. And I had been asked to compete with them for the job. So you can imagine how welcome I was when I got that job, having never worked in the home health service beforehand. And 2 of those people are very good friends to this day now. But the first 6 months of establishing my credentials and credibility with that group, there were 2 things I had to do. One is you never pretend you know more than the people in the service that you're in. Because some people think the only way to be a leader is you must know everything. Well, believe you me, the more you go up, the less you know. And if you're not honest with yourself about that, you're going to come a cropper. And if you try to pretend you know more, you get caught out very quickly and you lose credibility. So I went into that role. I was very lucky in that these were the days when we had long and onerous strikes. And there was just such a strike happened in Hackney. It was a very politically left council, so when people went on strike, they went on strike seriously. And we as a group of management had to keep the service going. Home helps were by then a 24/7 service. So I went to work in one of the area offices, and I both had to do some of the admin work and then go out and do some of the practical tasks. And that helped people see that I wasn't just a stuck-up idiot who sat in an office. Another time I was asked at very short notice, one of my colleagues left the director role to go to Birmingham at short notice for the council's housing department, which is a very large department, very political department, and I was asked to take that on in addition to my existing duties. And again, I had to follow the same path. People were, what's this guy from social care coming into? What does he know about council housing to run this? How can he be an effective leader of our services? And I had to knit that service together with other services into a common directorate that was there, which was very interesting. So I have aspired to be team leaders and service heads, but not necessarily the top jobs. That's been a different propulsion for that. Okay. Any other questions or comments? You're not going to give me any chances to pitch something at me. You can. I think something. Go on, Harpal.
What do you think is your biggest strength?
All right. So I'm very. I think the thing that propels me through and that propel anybody through is you have to be genuine. You have to be yourself and you have to be authentic. That word authentic is a bit of a big word, but if you're not, it's very difficult for people to trust you. And in our services, the patient has to trust you as the clinician. You have to trust your team manager to be an effective clinician. If something fractures that trust, people start withholding. They don't tell you much, they don't do as much, they start protecting, they start doing sort of defensive things. And at the heart of trust is being a genuine individual and being very consistent. So if I say some things like this and I speak to you in this particular way, and then I turn into, I don't know, some raging monster, in a moment, you're not going to trust me. So if I have a sort of Jekyll and Hyde kind of personality, it's going to be very hard to trust me because you don't know who's going to turn up. Is James the friendly boss going to turn up, or coach, or is James the brutal boss going to turn up? It's I'll show you the brutal boss in a moment. But but I think that being authentic is really important, but I think there's a second part to this. And I'm stealing from somebody else as I speak these words because he summed it up better than me. There's a man called Gareth Jones who wrote a book, Why Would Anyone Follow You? You can Google it and find it. It's about 6, 7, 8 years old now. It's something like, why would anybody follow you? He lives in Islington. He's a UK professor, but he's an international coach. He coaches the top 100 FTSE people. And he summed it up by, authenticity is the first thing. If you're not an authentic, trustworthy individual, you're going to struggle in a leadership role. But he said the second issue is that's not enough on its own. The second issue is you have to have skill. You have to be able then to exercise your values, your priorities with skill. Because if you're incompetent, if you're a nice person but slightly bumbling, you're a nice person but you're slightly bumbling, and I can't respect you in a particular crisis, or I wouldn't particularly follow you into a difficult set of circumstances because you might fumble it. You might. So confidence in leaders comes also from the confident exercise of their skill and their professionalism. So developing yourselves, acquiring skills, exercising those skills, I think are the two key characteristics of what we look for in leaders. Those two combined together with a commitment to do the right thing nearly always combust into good leadership. You can't go far wrong with those. And there's one question there, yes.
Throughout your career, have you come across senior people having resistance to change?
Oh yes, all the time.
How do you get around it?
With difficulty. So no, you must, if you're looking for new modules, if you haven't covered this off, the management of change, there's a common what they call the change curve. And it's not unlike the bereavement curve, if you've ever done any bereavement work, where the first thing people do confronted with a harsh reality, say death or any other change, is they deny it. The very first reaction is, I don't believe it, this can't be happening. This isn't part of the plan. This is going to change something. The more fundamental the change, the more people want to deny it. The second cycle is anger. I must fight against this. I must rage against the dark. This can't be right. I must defend the status quo in some way, shape, or form. Then there's the world isn't going to stop, and you can't stop it changing. So then people think, and they try to start adapting to it, and they begin to engage with the change, and they begin to think about how can I cope and adapt in these circumstances. And then there's resolution. I've come to a new view of the world, I've accepted the realities, and I'm now living in that new world. And guess what? I'm coping and I'm thriving in that new world. I've recovered from the threat. So the change cycle is very, very similar to that particular position. And nearly always you must anticipate the anger and the denial and the anger at the front end of a change process, because we've adapted to cope in quite challenging circumstances, and just delivering day-to-day healthcare is challenging enough. It's got its own inbuilt stresses, that dealing with the patient's anxieties and worries, the logistical issues of getting through your tasks in a particular day are stressful enough. So for somebody to come and disrupt that is only adding to the burden of that stress. And you have to be ready for that. We know that communication is a critical issue. The less of a surprise it is, the better. The more people know, and you are honest with them. So when I was closing many, many residential care homes and nurseries, my week was often going from one institution to another and talking to the staff and talking to the mums and talking to the sons and daughters of the old people who were in these homes and out saying, this is why this has to change. This is why this home is going to close or this nursery is going to close. This is what's going to happen to mum and dad. This is what's going to happen to you, the staff, in all of that. And it's not just one communication. It's 2 or 3 or 4 such communications because of that cycle. You have to allow people to take it on board, you have to allow people to wrestle with it. You have to take a bit of the heat back and not get it too personal. My most severe example of that was in a council chamber when Meals on Wheels were changing. So we used to cook meals in a kitchen, we used to put them in sort of mobile bain-maries, and we used to take them out and give them to people like airline food in a little thing with a top on it, as you take Chinese takeaway from a takeaway food. And then Cook Chill came in changed the whole model of what we could do. A, it gave the patient a lot more choice. B, actually the nutritional value of a Cook Chill meal warmed up in a microwave is better than one that leaves a kitchen and 40 minutes later arrives to you sort of tepid in a box. But people were very wedded to the fresh cooked model that we had and the way in which we delivered it. So I was presenting this change in a council chamber to a group of councillors, one of whom was a retired gentleman, a councillor in Hackney and Newcastle. And we were sat in rows in a very formal chamber. And as I was speaking about it, he suddenly started advancing towards me from across the room. And I thought, oh, he's a bit deaf, he's going to want something, or I can hand him a piece of paper. And he got up to me, and I was ready to give him some paper. And before he knew it, he clocked me right across the jaw. And so this is a very extreme view of resistance to change, okay? But he was convinced in his mind that Cook Chill was really suspect and that I was going to force these councillors to poison the elderly, and he believed it. You know, he wouldn't have done it. He was a nice man. I knew the man, okay? But he believed that, and he saw me as the architect of that change. So that's a very extreme example. It's only happened once or twice in my life that it's been like that. Does that answer your question? But always with change, there's going to be some resistance. And do you know what? It's healthy because it makes you refine your thinking. In some of the challenge you get from people, if you haven't thought through your change well enough, and they think of an angle where they don't think this is going to work very well, it helps you forge a better change as a result. So a change that goes through with no resistance, watch out, because you'll hit a pothole the other side of the gate, if I can put it like that. You'll think, oh, I'm on a smooth path here. Oh, it's all wonderful along. And because you haven't thought something out, bang, you know, something will happen to you in the implementation of the change. Good.
Thank you.
All right, welcome. Thank you. Oh, the fun bit.
So,
Fantastic.
James is your CEO, so you can email him, contact him. This isn't the last time you're going to...
Actually, there are 2 ways you can do that. You can email me directly, or you may have missed one of those today in the Trust pieces or the Trust news. There's a site on the hub, ask a question to ELT members, so not just to me. It's very underutilized. I've not been notified anything on it yet. Sorry? Zero, exactly. So it's there waiting for you. There are ways to have a conversation with me less than face-to-face if you need to. Thank you.